Hello and welcome to the Network Automation Nerds podcast, where we explore the latest in network automation from a practitioner's perspective. I'm your host, Eric Cho, a network engineer who loves everything about network automation. Today, we're delighted to have Damien Garros with us once again. You might remember Damien from his previous appearances when his company, OpsMill, was still in stealth mode, super secretive. And at the time, he was capturing attention with a lot of intriguing hints on what is now Infrahub today. As the CEO and co-founder of OpsMill, Damien has been at the forefront of transforming the industry with cutting-edge network automation solutions. Since we last spoke, OpsMill has emerged from the shadows of, stealth mode and is making waves as one of the leaders in network source of truth in the field. Today, we'll dive into the progress Infrahub and OpsMill has made and get an insider's perspective on the latest trends and breakthroughs in network automation. So welcome back to the show, Damien.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
I think last time we spoke, as we mentioned, OpsMill was kind of in stealth mode, but at the time, there's a few people, Kirk Byers included, he tweeted out, so it was right after AutoCon 0. It was like, hey, the most exciting thing that I'm looking for is, well, I don't know if Infrahub had the name back then, but like OpsMill, Infrahub. But before we do that, since we, last spoke, and it was like 2 episodes, and you actually went into great depth on, coming to the US in early stage and how to become, founding your company. So we'll leave the detail to those episodes. We'll include that in the show notes, but just give us maybe like a 30-second to 1-minute overview of just put things into context, your background, and how did you get here?
Yeah, so, very briefly about me, Damien Garros, started OpsMill now 2 years ago. Previously, I was been working in networking for joint networking, I think, 15 years ago. I've been doing network automation for the last 15 years. I think my 2 main passions have been about pretty quickly realized that it's all about data management.
Mm-hmm.
I really started focusing to me on the 2 main data sets that matters, the intent and what is actual in the network, so observability and source of truth. I've been doing a lot of work on that, and I got to a point where I was like, okay, there's so much to do on the source of truth space, we got to start a company for it. So try to solve some of those problems.
Yeah, you believe in so much that you throw everything in and you took on the risk of being an entrepreneur and started a whole company for it. I like that statement.
Actually, if I can, it's weird sometimes because, now like people are labeling me as a vendor. It's like, oh, Damien's a vendor. So, sometimes I feel like they put a filter in front of everything I say, being like, I'm all tainted. But it's funny because for me, I really it's the other way around. Like I was so passionate about this topic that I became a vendor because I felt like that was the best way to solve those problems. But anyway, so I guess I'm a vendor now.
All right. So if I cannot refer you to as a vendor, and I do remember the very passionate toward the end of AutoCon 2, the thing about vendors, whether we should let them in the room or not. I understand the kind of emotion associated with that term. So if I don't refer to you as a vendor, how should we refer to you and I both, right?
I like to see myself as a network automation architect, and I guess the CEO, in the field again as an automation architect.
Mm-hmm.
Really trying to, solve problems and build better automation platforms for everyone.
Yeah.
Just feel like doing it as a vendor is actually the best way to, touch more people. Like at some point I was working for end customers, like when I was at Roblox, I was building those platforms, even when I was at Network to Code. And it always felt like, at least at Roblox, we would solve it for one customer. And I always wanted to solve it for more. And I think, jumping to the vendor side is the way to go. I feel like we could have more collaborations within the industry. Sometimes vendors are a little bit the black sheep, it feels like. But
well, yeah, I've been on both sides, right? I've been on the customer side. And in fact, I've been on some of the most arrogant customers, I would say, right? Like always treat vendors not very well. And been on the customer side as well and the vendor side now. So maybe we should come up with like a new term, which is more collaborative partnership, right?
I like that. I like that very much. Yeah. Yeah. Because I think we're all in this together. We need each other, I think, on both hands. And there's so many things to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Should definitely collaborate.
You heard it first. Vendors, maybe like vendors, partners. I don't know if our listener have any idea, please do a follow-up and let us know. But anyways, yeah, we got sidetracked. So I remember last time, we talked about your background. I really enjoy, listening to people on their path. You talked about your previous experience at Roblox and also Network to Code and, founding the company. So can you bring us up to speed from there? I think where we stopped was, you're just about to launch this product out. And obviously there's a lot of unknowns. And since then, it's been top 3, I would say. So bring us up to speed on what happened in between we last spoke.
Yeah, it's been a journey. I feel like it was yesterday.
Me too.
I think it was 18 months ago or so, the podcast. But yeah, so on our side, the company, I think probably doubled in size. Now we have 20 people
Oh, nice.
spread out across Europe and the US. We actually did the first official public beta release that was in May 2024.
Hmm.
And then at the end of 2024, we actually had our first like 1.0, like so when we really had our first customers going in productions, we had. So yeah, it's been a lot of work. We've been working on adding a ton of features. More recently, it's been a lot about hardening and all the enterprise features that are very important to actually go in production. But yeah, we've been shipping, major release every 6 to 8 weeks since. So you make the math, like 18 months, I think probably had 8 or 9, even maybe more, like major release and new features and evolution. So yeah, very happy with the team. I think we've been able to keep a really good pace. I always would like to go even faster, but I think that would be challenging at this point.
Like really popular projects. I think Flask, right? Like it's been point 0.9 for I don't know 7 years, used by thousands, but it's still not 1.0 or production or anything like that. So what makes you think that, hey, we're just going to label it as 1.0, as opposed to beta?
Since the beginning, there were some features we knew that were super important, but we just didn't put the focus on it because we felt like to explain the visions, to start showing people what Infrahub is about, they were not mandatory. They were mandatory to go productions, but not to start engaging with customers. Things like SSO
Hmm.
and the permission frameworks and some of those very enterprisey features, we knew they could come close to last, at least in the past to the 1.0.
Right.
That's really what was important for us. And also because we're a data management platform, I think what was very important for us is to be sure we can stand by the platform and say, whatever happened, we will never get you in a positions where you're stuck and we'll never lose data and all of that. So there was a lot of features to work on, like make sure we have proper migration in place, we have proper backup and all of those things that are, again, not critical when you're doing testing and you're doing beta, but that are absolute must have when you go in production. So that's where we put the line.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that's the difference between maybe like an open source project versus a enterprise backed project is where you have this list where it's not a moving target. A lot of times I think people were having this commitment issue of going, 1.0 or production, that is because it's always this moving target. But you have these list of things that you wanted for minimum viable product or minimum livable product versus things that are super important, maybe tier one, but it's not required to just get the people to use the product and give you feedbacks. So I like that very much. So if you were to kind of describe what Infrahub is, right? I know it's kind of hard in a podcast or voice only platform, but if you were to describe to people through this medium, how would you describe your product?
So we like to describe Infrahub as a data management platform.
Hmm.
And so it's one of the main components of a larger platform, which we define usually as the infrastructure management platform. So
Hmm.
in short, to manage your infrastructure through automation, you need multiple tools. And one of them is going to be the data management platform that the goal is to capture the intended state of your infrastructure.
Okay.
It's about capturing all the information that describe how the infrastructure should look like.
Hmm.
And so the specificity of this data set is that it's a data set that needs to be like you keep adding to it every time there is a new component you want to manage in your infrastructure.
Okay.
So what we see is there is a huge requirement for having a flexible database. Like we need to have a system that can accommodate almost any type of data. And we also see challenges around like you have technical data, but you also have business data, service data. So there's a lot of challenge around schema management. So I guess we'll talk more about it. And the second point is this data set is mainly managed by human. It's really not all data sets actually have that. It's like a lot of data sets, if it's just about ingesting, for example, like the observability, a human doesn't control what gets recorded, it's just a system that records. But when we talk about the source of truth and Infrahub and the intended state of the infrastructure, it's a data set that is really controlled and catered by human
Hmm.
in a way that change control is very, very important. And usually like when humans want to make changes, they need to have a place where they can actually take some time. They need to prepare those changes, they need to validate those changes. So that's why one of the key features we had in Infrahub was we wanted to have version control and collaboration features that makes it really appropriate for humans to work on those data sets. But at the same time, we wanted also to have great APIs because nowadays, of course, you want your data to be easily accessible and all. So those are the two main specificity of the space and what Infra provides as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned a few times, I mean, I guess the name Infrahub, right? Like you're really intended for infrastructure in capturing states. And so that will be all inclusive of servers and even power or, any information in the infrastructure space. But we often discuss Infrahub in the space of network management, network automation. That's your background, that's your passion. So, how do you see that positioning? Do we just start with the network and then kind of infiltrate over, or like, how do you see it?
So for us, actually, infrastructure, the way we see it, is composed of three main pillars:
Sure.
networking, cloud, and security. It's a very simplified view. Of course, there's a lot of other things, but when we look at infrastructure management, infrastructure automation, that's how we've classified things. And in many ways, to us, it feels like it's the same problem. Like data management is a problem to all three of them. There's a lot of similarity between them. At the end of the day, they need different schemas, they need different type of object, but the concepts are very, very similar across all of them. It's just there's differences in our perspective, in my perspective, in the networking field, because at the end, like a network is composed of thousands of elements, but it's usually one network. You tend to have a lot more data to manage if you want to automate. So from an implementation standpoint, the needs to have a proper data management platform is much, much stronger right now in the networking field, because you just have to manage a lot more information. I feel like in cloud, you have an overall volume of data that is probably very large, but it's a lot of small independent data sets that can be managed more independently. Where in the network, it's usually like to automate the network, you need to have a full visibility about the applications that are connected to it, about all the different physical environments and all that. So that just put a lot more pressure and constraints on, I think, on the network field. So that's why we're seeing so much interest right now in this, what people define as source of truth. Again, for us, source of truth is the same as data management platform. I just don't like the source of truth term, but I guess that's what we call it.
Yeah, so I also want to give a shout out to NetBCN. I think you and two other, gentlemen from Netbox Labs, Mark and Jason Edelman from Network to Code, were just recently at the NetBCN event, which is like a long talk, and just having all kinds of interesting discussions. And so we'll have it in the show notes on just different aspect of, maybe you don't want to call it source of truth, but it's the data management problem, or back to what you were just talking about on how the network is very distributed, and testing is hard and all goes into, because you need visibility on so many items, and sometimes it's just across very dispersed systems, right? Like even for cloud, I mean, you could probably count the number of the top cloud providers with one hand, right? So then within that cloud infrastructure, you have a autonomous management organization body, versus maybe your network, you have one vendor who's doing the IPAM where you need that information, somebody's doing DSIM that you need that information, or Salesforce tickets, and not to mention different vendors and servers and applications and all of that. So yeah, I think our listeners and myself totally get what you were talking about on the dispersed and data management problem that we're facing today.
Yeah, 100%. It's a big problem.
So you mentioned it's been not long, right? Like, if you're talking about just, having customers and coming out of beta just within last year, are you comfortable in saying maybe some of the customers, the type of verticals that you see, Infrahub most fitted in, and like the scale of the network that you were able to use Infrahub to manage?
Yeah, for sure. So, we're seeing actually a lot of people reaching out to us and telling us like, hey, we've been trying to build that in-house for years and
Hmm.
we haven't been successful, and we're really interested to work with you guys. So right now, the main verticals, I think, is enterprise, like medium and large. We have some customers right now, they're actually building, like one of our customers, for example, they're building a huge GPU, like AI cluster composed of, thousands of switches and tens and thousands of servers on Infrahub, just to give you some scales. And otherwise, we're seeing a lot of tier 2 and tier 3 service providers that have like more specific, they want to have really their own schema. They want to have more complex services they want to manage. And so they're interested to use Infrahub as well. Usually right now, the one that are very interested to work with us are the one really that understand the importance of having your own schema.
Hmm.
Or I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I know you want to talk about trend. Like what we're seeing a lot nowadays is people, they want to manage each technical elements of their infrastructure. They want to resonate about services, or they want to resonate about design.
Hmm.
So there's this, I think one of the big trend is this design-driven infrastructure automation or network automation, where you don't want to think about every single component, but you want to think about, my service to my customer. That's what I think about. And then at the end, the service will be composed of a VPC, 5 IP addresses, and maybe you'll have some VMs, maybe you'll have some VLANs configurations. Like there's n number of technical elements that needs to be managed throughout the infrastructure, but you want to think of it as a service, as a logical representation. I think that's been the real challenge to actually do that today, because again, that push even more pressure to have a very flexible place to store that data, where you can define yourself your own schema. Because when it comes to services, like no two customers have the same schema. So the customers that are very interested and understand the value of syncing at this level, they're very eager to work with us in Infrahub. So, and we appreciate that.
I do want to talk about trends. So it's a great segue into, I think, that topic. So are you saying Infrahub is especially flexible in terms of having a design-driven architecture, as well as having a very high-level overview without getting into like almost declarative versus, procedural, that type of stuff? Is that what I'm getting at?
Yeah. Actually, it's one of our main, features and differentiators. So maybe to expand on the flexible schema, because I realize we say that a lot and most people don't understand.
Yeah, maybe just describe like a typical schema, right? Like, so it's kind of abstracted in a way that until I actually tried out Infrahub within, CodeSpace, kudos, by the way, like able to do things in CodeSpace without, having to install something locally. But yeah, so maybe you could describe what a schema is and how is that flexible in terms of compared to like traditional relational database?
A schema will define how the data is stored and connected. So if we take the most basic examples, you usually have a schema that defines what is a device,
Yep.
what is an interface, how an interface connects to a device, how an interface connects to an IP address, how you're going to have a cable that connect two interfaces together. So that's the representation of your data. That's the schema.
Hmm.
If you wanted to build your own application today, you would usually define this schema at the database level. Usually you would do that with SQL.
Yep.
And then you would have to build an entire applications to actually let other system access that data. You will have to build a UI, you'll have to build your own APIs and all of that. And usually we actually find customers that say, hey, we really wanted to have our own schema. So we built the database, but we never had enough resources to actually build a UI or build an API. So right now we're just querying straight into the database, and that creates a lot of issue.
Yeah. No kidding.
It's crazy actually the number of people that are still dealing with that today. Like it's definitely significant. So with Infrahub, what we did is you provide the schema in the form of a YAML file.
Hmm.
So it's pretty much, we actually try to push to be able to capture, to have even more language, or like the schema exposes some information that let us capture a lot of information about what you actually want to do. And then you give that to Infrahub and automatically will build the UI and the API for you. Like you don't have to do any more code. Like technically you don't have to write any code to get a fully functional applications that has UI, forms, full API, and also full version control, because you will be able to create branches on your database based on your schema and all of that. So that's really, I think, one of the big value proposition for Infrahub. And then when you have that, when you think about it, like earlier we talked about schema in terms of representing a physical topology with device and interface and IP, but when you start representing services, or when you start representing more abstract design that you're thinking about, you can do the same. Like for example, we have customers, a use case that is very popular is thinking of sites as a design. Like let's say you're a retailer and you have, thousands, hundreds of sites. Each of them have probably between 5 to 20 network devices. They have firewalls, they have specific design. Usually you can have classified them in terms of like small, medium, and large, and you want them to look fairly similar, but there's always some exceptions. Then you will be able to represent this site, not in terms of a physical location, but like what is the design of this site? And you'll be able to express what is the level of redundancy that you want, what is the type of hardware that you want to use. Like all of that is just data at the end. So you'll be able to capture that in Infrahub easily. And then we'll have the ability. So we have these functions internally. We call that a generator.
Hmm.
It's a Python script that you write that will make the glue between the representation of your design. So what is your site? And these generators will actually generate all the technical object that you want. So for example, it will create the cabling plan, it will create the device, it will create assign the IP address, it will do all of that for you. And then if you want to change something, you don't have to touch at all these technical elements. You just have to update the definition of your design. And these generators will work idempotently to be able to keep your technical elements in sync with that. It might be a little hard to explain over a podcast, but it's a very, very powerful concept.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit. So you were talking about a schema that specify your design. Maybe your, like, I don't know, McDonald combo A, combo B, combo C. Within there, there's comes great power with, this flexibility, right? Because one of the reasons why SQL databases are in use today is because it enforces relationship. If it was specified as one to many, then there's no way that you could do a one to one or vice versa or foreign keys and stuff like that. But it sounded like if you're just a YAML file, how do you enforce certain rules that you need for business logic?
We have the same, like in Infrahub schema, you also define, is it a one-to-one, one-to-many, all of that. And so we will do all this enforcement. That's actually part of what we call the core engine of Infrahub is most of the things you get from an SQL language will be able to capture that also in Infrahub.
Okay, cool. So you actually have another layer that is kind of this enforcing rules or your logics so that you're not just freewheeling putting anything in your schema.
Oh yeah, 100%. The goal of the schema is really to clearly define all those rules,
Hmm.
and then Infrahub will enforce all of them. The difference, I think, with the relational database is internally we're actually not using a relational database, we're using a graph database,
Sure.
which give us an interesting perspective is in a relational database, traditionally, a schema is hard to create, but it's even harder to update.
Mm,
And in Infrahub, we have a way that the schema is actually a user space, so it's much easier to update the schema. There's less constraints on what you can do and cannot do and all that. So it's something like the schema, I like to say it lives in user space, meaning you don't have to restart the entire application if you make some changes to it, where usually in a traditional application, like changing the schema is a big operations and you need to completely restart. It's a major upgrade. Like for us, updating the schema is actually something you can do. You can have a different schema on every branch.
yeah.
I know it sounds a bit crazy sometimes, but that's the level of flexibility that you get.
Yeah, not to get too nerdy, right? But like a user space versus like a kernel space. I think what you're implying is you won't touch the core, right? Like every single branch and then your core is still protected, but your flexibility lives in a separation, a guardrails that you provided for people. So you mentioned part of the problem you want to solve is for a trend that you're seeing was more toward design driven, and then Infrahub is primed to solve that problem. So what other trends in network automation that you're seeing that maybe wasn't there just a year or 2 years ago?
I mean, hard to not mention all the trend about AI. I feel right now there's a lot about AI and agent, specifically those agentic agent.
Sure.
So it's a field on its own, but where I think it's interesting, at least to our space, is those agents, those AI, they need a lot of data. And so there's a lot of work right now on how do we give those AI agents access to the data that we have in the data management platform, in the source of truth. So there's a lot of, work around that. And I think it actually put more pressure on us to make sure that we have well-documented APIs, we have well-documented schemas that basically, like, if we want those AI system to automatically learn what kind of data they can access and how they can access it and all of that, it means that, you need to have a very, very good system with a really good API. And that's exactly what we're doing with Infrahub, but I think it's very interesting what's going on there. I think, again, I'm probably not objective here, but I think source of truth is a big trend right now.
Hmm.
There's a lot of talks about it, and I think it's one of the reasons why Infrahub exists also. We're seeing more and more people looking at Kubernetes. They want to reuse some of the concept, which in many ways for me, it also means that we're moving more toward like declarative automation.
Yeah.
I think it's a very established pattern in the cloud, but I think it's becoming stronger and stronger in the world of network automation. So really thinking of declarative, thinking of having a place where you'll be able to define like what is the intended state of that component. And then I think it's all about decoupling and actually making it easier to scale those systems. So again, in those environments, like having tools like Infra becomes super important. So we're seeing a lot of that. What trend are you seeing, Eric? You're also very close to that.
Yeah, I think I talked to enough people and I would concur with you on all of them. right? Like, the need for data, the need for reliability and automating, documentation APIs and all that, right? Like, can you imagine creating endpoints one by one and then put in like, I don't know, what the functionality of like once you hit this API. And that's what we used to do. I mean, I used to work for vendors who does not have this framework or like Django REST framework, for example, right? Like they actually manually create those and that become very hard to keep up to. So everything that you talked about, but one thing that I do want to kind of clarify a little bit for people, because we talked about this as if there was a common term like declarative versus procedural, right? So I do want to bring back to put a little bit of definition around it. So can you tell us, for those of us may not be working with on a daily basis, what's the difference between like what do you mean by declarative?
Yes. So maybe we should actually talk about the other one before talking about declarative, which is what people usually refer as imperative. Imperative is more like when, you define each step one by one. And the best way to think about it is basically what humans do. Usually when you do a manual task, you connect to a device, you type a command, and then you do another actions and another actions. And at the end, you have achieved something. Like if you wanted to configure a VLAN on the box, that will probably take 10 different steps. And if you were to automate that in an imperative way, you would use a tool that will do those 10 steps, but in an automated way.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of people starts because you have the automation that kind of mimic what a humans will do. It's a natural way of thinking about it. Now, what we've seen is the more steps you have in your workflow, in your imperative workflow, the harder it is to develop them and the harder it is to maintain them. And so there's a big burden because, the more system you touch, there's the more interactions and all of that. And usually there's also the challenge that if you have a 20 steps workflow, each step kind of depend on what happened at the previous step.
Right.
So if the previous step kind of failed, then everything has to fail. So then you have multiple paths. So the complexity is kind of exponential in those systems. And Google actually wrote a very interesting paper on that a few years ago that explained how, probably for them like 8 or so years ago, they started introducing more declarative patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Where they would define the end state of a system. And if you wanted to make a change to the system, you will not directly connect to that system. You will just go to a central place and you will modify what is the end state. And then you will have dedicated agents that would actually make sure that the system that you're targeting reflects the end state that you've defined in your central place. And in many ways, the way to think about it, it's pretty much Terraform. Like what Terraform does for the cloud, it's exactly that. Like for people that are familiar with Terraform, you just define what is the end state. You have your TF file. And then Terraforms will take care to create the device or create the instances that needs to be created, modify them if they already exist, delete them if so. But you never have to tell Terraform, hey, what are the 5 steps to create a VM on Amazon?
Right.
It knows how to do that. You just say, I want a VName on Amazon, or I want 5 of them or 10 of them. So that's really, for me, the definition of this declarative pattern. And so, yeah.
I think that's a great explanation. And the way that I, kind of thought about imperative versus declarative. I mean, I use procedural, but it's kind of the same thing. The imperative is that like OS upgrade, right? Like, so you could define on, you want to upload the image, you want to change your boot order, and then you want to reload the router. Those are, imperative steps. Those are the 5 steps that the humans do, and then you just kind of codify it. But with a declarative, you just say OS upgrade, yes. And here's the version, right? And then you kind of offload all of that complexity into your tool, and the tool will be responsible in, say, fact gathering on, oh, this is a Juniper device, this is a Cisco device, and therefore these are the steps that I do need to go follow because this is not just a Cisco device, but this is an iOS XR, this is the Nexus OS or whatever. So I think that is a major milestone if we could get there. And no wonder why people are going toward it, because if you're really talking about one step further, which is another trend that, I wanted to hear your thoughts on was, like kind of a self-healing network, is that if you want to have self-healing network, you absolutely need this middle step versus that you have to go codify every single procedure.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe just to step back on it,
Sure.
I'm having a lot of discussion with people around that. And
Mm-hmm.
it feels like one of the specificity of networking is like, for example, in the cloud, they went almost 100% declarative.
Right.
And it feels like it's been working really well. But I think in specifically in the space of networking, there's a need to have a more balanced probably approach. And we probably, what I'm seeing as a successful methodology is to actually have both. Like we need to mix some piece of our workflow that will become declarative so that we can offload, as you say, the complexity to specific agents and all of that. But we probably also need to have more like imperative workflows that will sit on top of it to be able to manage more complex systems. Like the software grade that you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen anybody doing it completely in a declarative way. Because usually there's a lot of like, you need to do a draining first and then you need to
Yeah.
do some checks. And you don't want to mess up. Like, if that doesn't work, like, you don't want the network to be in a bad state. So I think one of the specificity of our field is we need to do a mix of both that doesn't necessarily exist or is the same, I think, in other environments.
I like that statement because sometimes you will hear people talk in absolute terms, right? Like, we absolutely need to get to this point and everything needs to be declarative or substitute declarative with whatever X, right? Like they thoroughly believe in. But we'll also come back to kind of reality and knowing that, this is definitely from a practitioner, right? Just from our conversation, you could tell like you've been to in scenarios where you do need to upgrade OS and you do need to operate in a multi-vendor environment, in a large scale environment. So we do need that kind of a compromise. And if I'm not mistaken, that's actually one of the things that you guys talked about at NetBCN, that why is testing in network so complicated or hasn't it fully implemented because of the scale and the complexity and, just testing in general, right? Like it hasn't happened. So all of these are just kind of these challenges, maybe just one or two steps removed from what we talked about, but it's still very real.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so you guys had a long conversation, and I have to admit, I have to cut myself halfway through that. But what are some of the kind of challenges that you see from network automation, that's stopping people from implementing? Was it skill sets? Was it tooling? Was it just quote unquote vendors that are not playing the game, or what?
The way I explained the other day to the team and some people, like what we're trying to build,
Yep.
to me, it's like if you think about automation as a car, we were previously on horses and now we want to go faster from A to B. And so that's the car.
Hmm.
Except that we live in a world where no one is selling a car. Like if you want a car, you have to build it yourself.
Right.
And I think the challenges that we're seeing today is that there's pretty much no blueprint. So if you have to build a car, you have to pretty much come up with your own blueprint.
Yeah.
And you can buy, let's say, or find some component of the car, but there's some of those components you actually need to build completely on your own because no one is actually providing them. So to me, it's this analogy with the car is clearly explain the challenges where we are as an industry. And in many ways, I think with OpsMill, like we're pretty much trying to with Infrahub. Infrahub is for me is like the engine, kind of an engine for this car. It's like one of the big components. And then now you can get this component from us and you still need to build your own car, but at least you don't have to build your own engine because I would not want to build my own engine myself. That sounds like a pretty complicated task.
Not to mention pretty dangerous, right? Like if I build my own engine, I don't know if I want my family in that car.
True, true. But yeah, I think as an industry, there's still a lot of challenges. It comes back to skills. I think skills is definitely a big one. I think because we probably are not building mature enough skills or tools, sorry, I think we also have some challenges to get users to adopt.
Yeah.
If we go again with this car analogies, like if we're building a lot of cars, but they don't feel really safe to drive because you're not really sure the engine is not going to explode and all that, then it's obviously harder. Like the guy who built the car is going to be okay to drive the car because he understands when he needs to stop if it starts to heat up and all of that. But maybe the Lambda driver is not going to want to get into the car because it feels unsafe.
Yeah.
So I think, we're still in this space where we're seeing a lot of homemade car out there, but I think they're struggling to really get them widely adopted, probably also because of that.
I like that example, but you also mentioned homemade cars, right? So right now, if I think about networking, it's almost as if you are a family that needs a car, you need to go build that car. And then you're simplifying the process and components of ready-made component like an engine that you could easily build your own car. But if you carry this out in a few steps down the line, do you feel at some point you're just going to have families who could like today, I don't go build anything. I just go buy a car, right? Like I offload that.
I think as an industry, that's where we need to go. I think, it probably take many years, but I think my prediction is over the year, we'll see more and more. And maybe there will be some vendors, maybe there will be some integrators as well that will like put together all the components and provide, cars and a lease where you don't even have to buy the car, but you would just be able to use the car. I definitely think, we'll see more of that. It's like, it's just the place where we are right now, where everybody needs to build their own car and develop some of the components themselves. I feel like it's really hard. Very, very few people have been able to do that successfully because of the complexity. And again, I don't want to be pessimistic. I think as an industry, we made a ton of progress in the last few years. So it's definitely easier today than it was a few years ago. And I think it will keep getting easier, but we're definitely not at a point where you can just drive the car and not have to hire any mechanics to help build the car, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, not to mention job security for those of us who are in the network operation space. But I think we should probably quantify that. I think the cloud's already there, right? You could rent a network, you could rent all these utilities off the cloud vendors. And we're really talking about on-prem. And some companies are there, like trying to offer that model like Niles and some of the other people who are trying to offer that. This just rent your network, even hardware on-prem, and then, we'll take care of that for you. But I think you're right, the majority of at least the companies who I have encountered with, as long as they have, even like a medium size, that they still need to have a lot of component, whether that's because of regulation, because of their financial services, maybe because of security, maybe just the comfort level that they have. They still have to have things on-prem. And those are the customers that we're talking about. Really just need to make those components a little bit easier.
Yeah.
So if I look back on, take that back into OpsMill and Infrahub, what are some of the newer features that you're looking, like the big components? I know there's a list that you say are necessary in order for it to go into production, not production, but out of beta, right? So now that you have a release 1.0, you have all these features that are kind of tiered zero that you have underneath your belt. What are some of the newer features that you're looking forward to build or to add to your current product line?
I think the next step for us is really thinking about the platform. Like today, we're focusing on the data platform.
Hmm.
I think we need to start making it easier to actually integrate all the different components together.
Okay.
And we need to make it easier to manage this multi-component system.
Okay.
And why I'm thinking about that is, I think the challenge, and I use AI to generate these pictures, like every customer that comes to us, they will say, oh, I need this, I need that, and I need a better dashboards, I need a better things, I need a better user interface, the one that we have for Infrahub. And at the end of the day, like what they describe is what they want to see when they're in the driver's seat.
Hmm.
They don't necessarily describe features they want on the engine. They describe something that they want the platform to provide. So I think as if we want really to scale all of that,
Yeah.
we need to make it easier to have multiple components that will work together. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot of thoughts, but, specifically the dashboard, specifically like how do we build better front end for that? I think today we're trying to have one product that will be the front end for the super technical guy, the non-technical person, the support person, the end users. And I think it's just unsustainable to imagine that everybody's going to use the same tools. But when you start thinking about multi-component, then it starts making a lot. If we have to reduce the efforts, for example, to build a form or to build a service catalog portal, then you can have, many different entry points to your platforms depending on the users. And to me, it feels a lot more sustainable. So I might be a little abstract for listeners right now, but I will say the two big things that will come is, simplify the building of those entry point, those front end, and simplify having a multi-component platform. I think is going to be some of the big things we're going to see in the futures. And of course, we're going to keep working on the data management platform and make it more reliable and scalable and all of that. But yeah, if we look at the big pictures, that's what's coming next for us.
I agree with that. And if you just look at, say, Python, for example, right? Like Python has the core, Python has batteries included. So it has the core and it has all these packages. But outside of that, what makes Python great is all these components and libraries that's added on top of it. So I think what you're describing makes a lot of sense where you need to have the core component, but everybody come in, the power users could pick and choose the components they want. The enterprise, the Fortune 100s could choose the ones that they want versus maybe a startup that they want different components. But that's a pretty big challenge to determine what do you mean by core and what do you mean by these components and the API touch points? Who is the demarcation of responsibility and how do you do that handoff? I think that would be pretty challenging, but it's a problem worth tackle.
Yeah, I think we definitely need some form of standardization. So again, I'm not talking, going IETF and all, but
I mean, 5 years later, we'll have something.
I think we need to have agreements within the industry and like how those components interact with each other.
Yeah.
To simplify the putting together those platforms, I think it's critical. Today, we're spending way too much time, and it's a huge complexity for people to actually build like really production grade platform.
So what's the next step in having this agreement that you were talking about? I've seen, work group that's being formed, maybe just, bird or feather discussions. And what are some of the next steps that we could take today to move us toward that goal, in your opinion?
There's an interesting working group that's going on right now in the Network Automation Forum that tried to help with the definition of a blueprint. First, I think, that's also something that we miss. It's great. And then regarding the implementation, hopefully we'll see more projects that will, make some proposals in this space and see how it goes. I'll say stay tuned on that if I can. Hopefully in a few months, I'll be back here and we can talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or, we'll just hear more about it when it comes out in AutoCon 3, 4. So as we record, it's March of 2025, right? So AutoCon 3 is on the horizon in Prague, and AutoCon 4 will be later in the year for the US. So hopefully, we'll make progress relatively quickly and at least make forward progress, right? I don't know if we're going to have anything concrete, but at least forward progress. So I think that's a very good segue into our next question was, any call to action just to get involved, or that'll be my call to action, right? Just get involved with Nav, pick a channel and just say hi and see which one is interesting to you. Well, any call to action from your part?
Yeah, call to action for Infrahub. Also, check on the doc site. I think there's a lot of a good documentation. There's been a lot of, if you want more interested to learn about design driven,
Yep.
we actually put some good blog posts recently, and one of our team, Wim, someone from our team recently did, I think, a really good presentation at Nanook that is a really good like examples with like demos and all that on how to build this design-driven approach. So, go check it out, and then you can download Infrahub, try for yourself, join us on Discord. What we see today is that the learning curve is still probably a bit steep. There's a lot of new concepts in Infrahub, so don't be afraid, and reach out for help. We're really happy to support anybody that wants to get on this journey with us. So.
Very cool. And we will definitely have those links in the show notes. I think we're coming up at time here. We could probably geek out on this for a lot longer. So, Damien, where can people find you or follow your work? Maybe follow Infrahub, OpsMill's latest trends. Where can people find you?
The best is probably LinkedIn
Okay.
to follow, either my profile or the company profile. And otherwise, I'm probably on every single Slack group there is, and Discord there is.
They have a dozen or so.
Whether it's the network to code one, the NAF one, packet pusher. Yeah, if you look for Damien or on all of them, I'm lucky, like there's not a lot of Damien in our industry, so I'm easy to find.
Yeah, I would second that. It's not very hard to find, and you're generally very responsive, I would say. If there's any particular question, if you add you, hopefully, it's not some crazy, complicated question. But yeah, I appreciate you participating in those events. And obviously, will you be at AutoCon 3 and AutoCon 4 this year?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
I think we already signed up for both. So yeah, looking forward to see everyone in Prague and to chat about network automation.
Are you going to wear those nice varsity jacket like your team has for AutoCon 2? I'm kind of jealous.
Yes, we will.
Nice. Cool. Well, thanks again for being here, Damien. It's always good to, catch up and listen to you talk about the progress you've made and also, the networking trends. So really appreciate you making the time.
Thank you. No, thanks for having me. That was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Network Automation Nerds. Do you have any feedback for Network Automation, our guest Damien today, or this episode in particular? Anything we talked about? Please do send us follow-ups if you have some of those feedbacks. We really do want to hear from you. And the way to do that is to go on packetpushers.net/follow-up. Please do check out our website at packetpushers.net to find other network engineering focused podcasts, blogs, YouTube videos, and so much more. You can find podcasts such as Network Break for weekly news, heavy networking for deep dives on technologies, and much more. We thank you, the wonderful listeners, for your support. Last but not least, remember that too much network automation will never be enough.